This is a langue de bœuf, braisé à la ménagère. It's a beef tongue braised and sliced on a mound of buttery mashed potatoes and surrounded by braised vegetables. We are speaking of tongues today on the French Chef.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation and by a grant from Hills Brothers Coffee Incorporated.
You know, the other day when I was mucking about in the supermarket looking for something to eat, I was sort of in a bad mood and nothing I looked at appealed to me at all. I looked at all the chickens and the ducks and the fish and the steaks and the lamb, and I just didn't want to cook any bit of it. I found myself staring at a fresh beef tongue, and I said to it, "You ugly old thing, I'd like to fix you up." Then I thought to myself, well, why not? It'll be a change anyway. So I trotted home with my tongue under my arm, and I braised it. And we had some friends in for dinner, and it was just so good. We just ate every bit of it up. And I was rather surprised. I'd forgotten what a beef tongue, how good a beef tongue would be. So I thought you'd enjoy seeing one today. You can buy tongues in various ways. You can buy a tongue that's pickled, or you can buy it smoked, you can buy it frozen, or you can buy it fresh. A pickled tongue is one that has been put down in brine. That's a salt solution, and it sits in that for about a month. And then sometimes also vinegar is added, and this preserves the tongue so it'll keep a long time. And a smoked tongue is just like a ham. But a fresh tongue is just perfectly fresh. It comes just out of the beef to you. And here's what it looks like. It is sort of an ugly old thing. As you see, you just wouldn't imagine how good it would be when you eat it. And if it's frozen, it comes like this in a block. This has been just partially defrozen. You just soak it in cold water, just the tip moves. But you see there's a lot of difference between a whole tongue. This one has not been trimmed, and this one has. On the frozen tongue, when it's defrosted, there's a whole lot of junk at the large end, and there's some little bones, and I don't know what all, and then underneath there's a lot of stuff which you have to take off. And sometimes your market trims the tongue so it looks like this, and sometimes it doesn't. My market always trims it so the large end has a little forked bone taken out, and then they take out a lot of the unedible stuff at the bottom of the tongue. And as you notice, the tongue, I always notice, has a mother of pearl skin on it. And the skin, after you cook the tongue, you peel the skin off. The skin is sort of like leather, and then inside it's nice and tender. And beef tongues are much the best. They have much more flavor. And an untrimmed tongue, just the way it comes out of the beef, weighs between 5.5 and 7 pounds. And when it's trimmed, it weighs 3.5 to 5 pounds. Those are the best weights to have. And if you have a fresh tongue, be sure that it smells fresh. That's always the way you can tell. If it has a nice, agreeable smell, then it's fine, because fresh tongues are very perishable from the time that it comes out of the beef to the time you cook it. It only lasts about 7 days. And because it's perishable, very often markets don't like to have them on hand, because unless they're bought right away, they spoil. And that's why very often you find them pickled or smoked, just because they keep much better. But the wonderful thing about tongue is that it's solid meat, and it's relatively inexpensive. It's about half or less the price of beef. Now, sometimes you'll find a tongue that has a black spot on it like this, which is called a blemish. And these tongues are usually cheaper, but the black spot doesn't hurt the tongue at all, because after you peel the tongue, the spot comes off and it just looks like any other tongue. Now, the tongue that I'm going to use today, this one is 3.5 pounds trimmed, and it'll serve 6 to 8 people. And then as soon as you get your tongue home, because it's perishable, you should prepare it, and that means the first thing you do is to scrub it under warm water. Take a vegetable brush and scrub the top of it all over just to make sure that it's nice and clean. In some markets they're nicely cleaned and in some they aren't, but you should clean it anyway. And then you ought to soak it. And that should be soaked for, I think, about 2 hours, and this freshens it up. And also, in case there's any saliva on it, we have to speak of saliva because that's what the tongue lives in. This will loosen all the saliva, and this really freshens up the tongue. So always soak it for 2 hours in several changes of cold water. And then the next thing you can do if you want, this is optional, is to salt it. And that means get some of this kosher salt. This is coarse salt, and get an enameled bowl or casserole and put a big layer of salt in the bottom of it, and then put the tongue in, and then cover with salt on the top. And then put a weight on it, a piece of wax paper, and I just use a heavy casserole or something and weight it down. And leave it for 2 or 3 days if you have time. Because this, I don't know why it is, this just seems to tenderize the tongue and also give it more flavor. And another thing is, if you find a nice fresh tongue and you're not going to cook it right away, if you salt it down like this, you can keep it 3 or 4 days and nothing will happen to it at all. So I think it's a very sensible thing to do, and if I have the time, I always salt it down. But of course, this is something you don't have to do. And then, when you're ready to cook it, you wipe the salt off and then wash off the tongue under cold water. And then you're ready to cook it. So that now is all ready to cook. And no matter how you're going to serve the tongue, you're going to have to boil it first. And you have to boil it so that you can loosen this white skin. If you don't boil it first, you can't get the skin off. And the tongue by itself has very little flavor. And that's really surprising when you think it's the tongue that does the tasting. You think, well, why doesn't it have any more flavor, like sweet clover or something? But it just doesn't have very much. So you have to provide the flavor in the way you cook it. And you can cook a tongue plain boiled, but if it's plain boiled, you have to cook it in a flavored liquid, such as water with vegetables and so forth, or in a soup stock. Or you can braise it. And that's what we're going to do, because I think that's much the best way to cook a fresh tongue. And by braising it, that means you boil it until it's about 2/3 done, just in plain water. And then you finish it off in a braising liquid, and that gives it an absolutely marvelous flavor. And I think just plain boiled tongue is very dull, while braised tongue is an absolutely delicious dish. And you want to have a large pot of water. I've got a tongue in here, which is ready to come out. And you just put it in, and you make sure that you have enough water to cover the tongue by about 4 or 5 inches, because as soon as it starts boiling, it swells, and it's got to be covered by liquid all the time. And this can go into cold water or to boiling water. It doesn't seem to make much difference. And if you have put salt on the tongue and let it sit for 2 days, you just boil it in plain water with no salt. And if you haven't salted the tongue, you add 1.5 teaspoons of salt per quart of water. And if you have a soup stock, that's all the better. Just put it right in the soup stock, and it is even better. And then you let the water come up to the boil, and as soon as it comes up, there'll be a whole lot of scum. And you take the scum off, just skim it off with a spoon, and then let it cook at a rather, you could say, a slow boil or a fast simmer. And because in this recipe for braising, it's only going to cook for 2/3. You let it boil for 2 hours, and then you peel it. If you wanted to boil it until it was tender, you'd have to cook it for about 3 hours. And then as soon as it's cooked, in this case cooked for 2 hours, you take it out, and you want to peel it, because it's much easier to peel it when it is cold than when it is warm than when it is hot. What do I mean? When it is warm than when it is cold. But if it's too hot, drop it in a basin of cold water just a moment so that it's cool enough to handle, and then you're ready to peel. And you see there, here's the thick end of the tongue that was by the throat, and here's the skin. And when you start to peel, you take a little knife and you slit the skin right at the edge between the top and the bottom, all around. Try to slit the tongue itself as little as possible. And then you'll find that the skin comes off the top of the tongue very easily. Of course, if you boil the tongue until it was completely tender, the whole thing peels easier than it does if you've just cooked it for 2 hours like this. But the top comes off really like a glove, revealing a lovely sort of pinkish flesh. And you just peel it all down. You'll find when you come up to the big end on the top that it peels with a little more difficulty. In that case, you just have to just peel it with your knife. The object is on the top to keep it looking just as nice as possible. And then on the sides, you have to loosen the skin and then peel that with your hands. Doing that on both sides. I'm just doing sort of a sample peeling to give you an idea. It's never a very quick thing when you're peeling only a partially cooked tongue, which you just go at it very slowly, trying to keep as nice an appearance on the outside of the skin as possible. And then when you get to the underside, that usually doesn't peel very easily. So what I always do is to take my little knife and slit down in strips about 1/2 inch wide. And then get under the strip with my knife and just peel away. The underside isn't going to show, so that it doesn't make too much difference how it looks. But the neater you can be, the better you will feel. Be sure that you have a very nice, sharp knife. Then you just continue along this way. And if you've bought a tongue that hasn't been trimmed, you'll have to trim it yourself. You cut off before you boil it all of the parts that look inedible, and then after you've boiled it, you'll find there are even more parts that look inedible. And the object is when you slice it, you want the slices to look nice. So just cut off the loose bottom parts, and then any edible parts you can save and use for second helpings or grind up and add to a meat pie or something like that. But the idea is trying to get the tongue to look just as nice as possible. There's always some fat on the bottom part of the thick end. And you want to get that off because that's not edible. And these, if you're cooking up a soup stock, you can add these pieces to the soup stock, and it'll give a little bit of flavor to it. Though actually, even the tongue boiling water has very little flavor. You see, I'm on the other side where there's this little fatty business underneath. Then you just continue with the peeling, and when you get it all done, it looks like this. That looks rather now like a lady's slipper, and it doesn't have that slippery look that it did at first. And then we're going to braise it, and you can braise it whole or you can braise it in slices. And I'm going to braise it in slices because I think it's much easier to do. But the thing is to try and slice it so that it looks nice. So I start on the top of the large size side of the hump and then cut down rather straight for 2 or 3 slices. And then I start going on a diagonal. The idea is, if possible, to make the slices look all the same, particularly as you get up to the top of the tongue. And try and make them even. You see, all that is solid eating meat, which is wonderful. And I'm doing these slices about 3/8 of an inch thick. Now I haven't gotten very well on that end, so I'm going to save that as a second helping. And now up here, I'm going to start going diagonally. See, going diagonally towards the tip gives you quite a nice slice, even as you get this far up the tip. And now I'm slicing it fairly thick because it's going to be braised, and if it's too thin, the slices may come apart. Well, these end ones aren't as good as they could be. I really should have diagonalized a little bit more. If I were working in a delicatessen store, I'd probably have tongue slicing down to a fine method. And now, after you've got it all sliced, you can cook it and slice it later, or you can refrigerate until you're ready to cook it. For the final cooking now, because this has only the tongue's flavor of its own little self, and the final one is going to be cooking in a delicious sauce, and this is going to be a French sauce that is sort of like the famous French demi-glace, but more of a homemade type, and it's going to be braised in this sauce. And this is going to start out with our little old friend aromatic vegetables cut into a mirepoix. And the aromatic vegetables are onions, carrots, and celery, very finely diced and then cooked in butter. And we've done this a great deal, many times, and this is one of the basic parts of la cuisine française. You just cut them into fine dice about 1/8 of an inch. About 1/8 of an inch thick, or you could cut them into very, very, very finely diced, which is called a brunoise. And we did that when we were doing fish fillets poached in white wine sylvestre, and that was delicious. So you want to have about 1/2 cup each of carrots, onions, and celery, and then also about 1/4 cup of very finely diced ham. This is just plain boiled ham, because the ham always adds a little extra flavor and is very good along with the mirepoix. So you just cut that all up. I'd like to know how many times we've done a mirepoix, but you just find it mentioned all the time, and it's the kind of thing that gives that little added amount of flavor to a sauce. And then after you have your mirepoix all cut up, you want to cook it in butter. And this cooks in about 2 tablespoons of butter for about 10 minutes until it's very lightly browned, and all of that amount, about 1.5 cups, just cooks down to this. And then you want to add a good stock to it. This means if you have a homemade beef stock, it would be delicious. And if you don't, you could use a good canned beef bouillon. And you want about 3 cups in there. And this is going to cook for 1/2 hour with some additional flavorings. And this is very much the kind of flavorings that you think would go well. I'm going to put in about 1 tablespoon of tomato paste and about 1/2 teaspoon of thyme. This depends entirely on how good your basic stock is. And then you want to let it simmer for 1/2 hour, and then the vegetable mirepoix and the stock have all cooked together and have gotten a lovely flavor. Now this is a home version of the French basic brown sauce called a demi-glace, which takes you several days to cook. And this starts out with a homemade stock and and then it's lightly thickened with flour and turned into what's called a sauce espagnole, and that cooks for about 8 hours. And then you thicken it again and cook it some more, skimming it, and after about 3 days you have an absolutely delicious sauce, but not many of us have the time to do that. And you can make a very good one if you put in the right flavorings. Now you want to thicken it a little bit because it's going to cook with the ham, so you want 2 heaping teaspoons, that'll be about 2 level tablespoons of arrowroot, and then mix that up with a little cold liquid, such as a little port wine. Mix it up until it's a paste. And arrowroot, we've used cornstarch a great deal, which is very good for a thickening, but arrowroot is a little fancier in that after it boils, the liquid is more clear. So that goes in, and that again is simmered for about a minute to cook the arrowroot, and then you have your sauce made. But you remember that this has to cook. You want to simmer your sauce for about half an hour before you thicken it, and then you're all ready to go. But I think not very many people anymore, except great restaurants, are able to do the marvelous old sauces of the French cuisine. But if you have a good beef stock to begin with and you do a very careful flavoring, you'll find that you will end up with an extremely good sauce. And this all depends on you sort of tasting and simmering and adding little bits of flavoring as you see fit. I see that I put a bay leaf in there too. I'm not sure that I mentioned it. And then after you've simmered it, you want to taste it very carefully, and if it seems a little bit too thick, you can add a bit of water. I have some tongue stock here. I think this is a little bit thick, so I'm going to thin it out with a little bit of tongue stock, and then it's going to go into our beef tongue. Now I'm first going to taste it, because it's just got to be absolutely delicious, because this is what's going to flavor the the tongue. And that is very good. Well, it ought to be, because I've been tasting it all the time. Now, your tongue slices go into they can go into a casserole and be baked in the oven, or you can cook it in a pan on top of the stove. So they just go into a flat pan. And then, if you want, you can also add some parboiled carrots and onions. These have been little white onions and carrots that have been cooked, just about 5 or 10 minutes, so that they can finish cooking with the tongue. And the tongue is going to take about half an hour or so to finish its cooking. And then the sauce goes over. And going to squish the sauce a little bit around over the vegetables, and then this simmers very slowly for about half an hour, or until it's tender when you pierce one of the slices with a fork. Now I must say this is a very easy way of cooking. Now here's one that is already done, and this is simmered the requisite amount of time, and it's tender, and it's all done. Now the nice thing about this recipe is that you can get all of this braising of the tongue ready. You could even get it ready the day before, and when it's cool, cover and refrigerate it, and then just reheat it again so that everything is hot through and you're ready to serve. So I think it's a very convenient and very tasty home recipe. And then when you're ready to serve, you can serve it either in the pan that you cooked it in, or you can mound it on some mashed potatoes, being sure that you have a hot platter and deliciously flavored mashed potatoes, and just mound them up like a peak in Darien, and then the tongue is going to go around the mashed potatoes. And you take the slices out first. I think I'd better put on my glasses. Take the meat slices out first and arrange them around the tongue, trying to splatter as little as possible on the platter. You know, I think it's awfully funny how some people are so squeamish about things. A friend of mine said, well, what are you cooking today? And I said, a beef tongue. And she said, oh, how can you? This is awful. Well, look what she's missing when you have, I must admit, when you first see it, it's a rather odd-looking thing. But when you get it all braised like this, just smelling perfectly delicious, and serve it in a pretty way, I just think you have a marvelous dish. Now, all this. Now, see if you have very even slices. That's a good thing. Now, there's my little bay leaf, which I take out. And then you put your cooked vegetables around. See if I've got one more piece there. I can put this on. And then the vegetables go around. And if you find that your tongue is done before the vegetables are, you just take the tongue out and simmer the vegetables a little bit longer. And then put the tongue back in again. I love having the whole main course on one platter. I think it looks awfully well, and then it's so easy to serve it. You don't have to keep running around the table with a whole lot of dishes. Then if you have more vegetables that then will fit on the platter, you can serve some in a separate dish. Then you'll probably, with this platter, I'll have a little bit too much sauce. So I'll just pour some of the sauce. And the mirepoix vegetables stay right in. I'm pouring some of the sauce over the tongue. And then if you've made any little dribbles on the platter, be sure and wipe them up. That's one reason you always have a very clean towel attached to you, because it's a bad thing to serve anything that's messy. And then so we have quite a few sauce and vegetables left, so that you could serve these separately or save them for a second course. And with this, the braised tongue, I think the best wine to serve would be a red Bordeaux, which would go beautifully with it. You know, I'm so glad that this tongue spoke to me at the supermarket the other day, because I think it's a great eating discovery. And when you cook it this way, sliced and braised in a lovely mirepoix sauce, it's absolutely delicious. I never paid much attention to tongues before, but now it's part of my in-group. So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appétit.
The French Chef has been made possible by a grant from Hills Brothers Coffee Incorporated and by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation. Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking.